All right, let's dive into the Cold War. It's this incredible story of how two global superpowers built up enough firepower to literally destroy the world, and then somehow found a way to step back from the edge. It's a total roller coaster of risk, and we're jumping right in.
So, here's the big question, right? Why would these two huge rivals pour everything they had into this insane arms race, only to turn around and race to disarm? It seems like a total paradox. What drives you to build weapons that can end humanity and then decide to talk about getting rid of them? It really comes down to a crazy mix of fear, power, and, well, the basic instinct to survive.
Okay, so where does this all start? Well, our story really kicks off right as another one is ending. World War II is over, but that alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, it just completely fell apart, and that lit the fuse for a new, and honestly, a much more dangerous competition.
And the speed of this escalation is just mind-blowing. Think about it. In 1945, after the super-secret Manhattan Project, the U.S. was the only country with the atomic bomb. But that monopoly, it lasted for like 5 minutes. Just 4 years later, boom, the Soviet Union detonates first lightning. And in that single flash, the arms race was officially on.
And just like that, the world had two nuclear superpowers. This wasn't a small change. The stakes of any conflict had changed forever. We're not talking about just another conventional war anymore. We're talking about the risk of wiping out everything. The whole game had fundamentally and terrifyingly changed for good.
So, with the planet basically armed to the teeth, where do you take the competition next? Well, it blasted off into the final frontier, space. And let's be clear, this wasn't just about exploring the cosmos for science. Oh no, this was a high-stakes battle for who was technologically and ideologically superior.
So in 1955, both sides basically threw down the gauntlet. They announced they were going to launch satellites. The message was crystal clear. If you control space, you have a massive advantage back on Earth. And that announcement, it kicked off this frantic, decade-long scramble for the heavens. The space race was on.
And you know what? At first, the Soviets were absolutely winning. They shocked the entire world with Sputnik in 1957, the very first artificial satellite. The U.S. had to scramble like crazy to catch up, launching their own just a few months later. Then, in April 1961, Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human in space. The U.S. follows just a month after with Alan Shepard. But you can see the pattern here, right? The Soviets would hit a major first, and the Americans would be racing to match it.
This is where that famous quote from President John F. Kennedy really captures the whole feeling of the moment. The U.S. realized it couldn't just play catch-up anymore. It needed a huge, ambitious goal to leapfrog the Soviets. And the moon became that goal. It was a symbol of American ambition, ingenuity, and just sheer determination.
And you know what? They actually did it. July 20th, 1969. That's the day. The day the United States effectively won the race to the moon. An absolutely incredible achievement that was born out of this intense, neck-and-neck rivalry.
But here's the thing. For all the incredible wonder happening up in space, we can't forget the sheer terror that was building down below. While the whole world was glued to the race for the stars, the danger on the ground was hitting its absolute boiling point. This tech race in space was mirrored by a terrifying game of nuclear chicken right here on Earth.
And that game of chicken reached its most terrifying moment in October of 1962. For 13 days, just think about that, 13 days during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the entire world stood on the razor's edge of nuclear war. This was the moment both sides stared directly into the abyss, and I mean, they did not like what they saw.
Okay, so after seeing just how close they came to wiping each other and everyone else off the map, something had to give. The sheer terror of the Cuban Missile Crisis basically shocked both superpowers into a whole new way of thinking. This relentless escalation, it just had to stop.
You could almost feel the world hold its breath, and then finally exhale. That near catastrophe forced a huge realization on both sides. They had to talk. Communication was absolutely essential for survival, and this led to a brand new era of easing tensions, known as détente. It's a French word that basically means relaxation. And one of the first major results of this new era was something called SALT I. Now, this wasn't about getting rid of all nuclear weapons, not yet. But for the very first time, both sides formally agreed to put a cap on building more of certain kinds of strategic weapons. It was a huge, historic step back from the brink. And it wasn't just about big treaties either. They took some really practical steps to avoid another crisis. A direct telephone line, the famous hotline, was set up between Washington and Moscow. And then there was this really clever bit of diplomacy.
ping-pong diplomacy. The U.S. used table tennis matches with China to open up relations, which in turn eased some of the pressure with the USSR. It was all about creating a more stable, less tense global situation.
Which brings us to what many people consider the high point of détente. But as you're about to see, agreeing to peace on paper and actually living it in practice, well, those are two very, very different things.
So in 1975, you've got leaders from 35 different countries all gathering in Helsinki, Finland. The agreement they ended up signing was seen as this massive diplomatic achievement. It was supposed to be the formal blueprint for how the capitalist West and the communist East could coexist peacefully. They cleverly split the whole thing into 3 baskets. The first basket was a huge win for the Soviets. The West basically recognized the post-World War II borders, which legitimized Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Okay. Basket 2 was all about cooperation, on trade, on technology, even a joint space mission. And Basket 3, this was a really big deal. It was a major concession from the Soviets. They promised to respect basic human rights, like freedom of speech. On paper, it looked like a perfect compromise, right? Everybody gets something.
I mean, on the surface, it really was a triumph of diplomacy, a true win-win. But the huge question just hanging in the air was it real? Would these words on a page actually lead to lasting peace? Did both sides really mean what they signed?
Well, the answer came pretty quickly in what happened next. See, you had decades of deep mistrust, and both sides felt this pressure to look strong back home, so they started undermining the agreement almost immediately. The U.S. kept right on developing new advanced cruise missiles. The USSR used that border agreement as a green light to crack down even harder in Eastern Europe. And then, the final nail in the coffin for détente, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. It was just a blatant disregard for the whole spirit of Helsinki.
And this quote really captures the ultimate takeaway perfectly. The Helsinki Accords, which were supposed to be the peak of détente, they ended up being just that, a temporary thaw. A short-lived break in the deep-seated superpower rivalry, but not the end of the conflict by a long shot.
And that leaves us with this final, really challenging thought. The Cold War shows us that, yeah, it is possible to pull back from the abyss, but it also shows that real, lasting peace needs so much more than just treaties signed on paper. It demands this fundamental shift in trust, and that is just agonizingly difficult to build. So the question that's still with us is, how do you actually build that lasting peace after you've stared into oblivion?